I'm Jude Barbeck. I'm the editor of Education Central. I've been, Education Central's been running for about 18 months now, was it? Yeah. So it's been an exciting venture to be part of, and this is our second foray into taking the debate off the pages that we're in into live discussion and debate. So we're thrilled to have you all here to enjoy that experience, and we want you to feel at ease and comfortable to ask questions as we go. So yeah. A little bit of housekeeping. Now, bear with me if I sound a bit vague. I don't work out of the Wellington office. I work remotely from Tauranga. So when I come up here, I'm always not totally sure where everything is. But the men's toilets is right behind you there. Ladies is through, follow your nose past the lifts. Yep. And then the stairs are beyond that in case of emergency. Is that right, Karen? Yes. Yeah. That's good with that. We're delighted to have the support and sponsorship of University of Auckland to make this possible. It's great to have their recognition of topics like this and really put their weight behind it, so we're grateful for that. So without much further ado, we'll introduce our stellar panel lineup we've got for you tonight. We've got no less than Ballyhag here joining us, which I'm delighted to have. He doesn't really need any introduction, I don't think, when it comes to the Tomorrow's Schools review. It has authored that great big report that you've read, I'm sure, from page to page, and so we're delighted to have Bally here to discuss that with us here tonight. Then we've got Karen Spencer, Deputy Principal from Wellington High School, joining us there in the panel. Linda Stewart, President of the NCDI. Yeah. We've got Peter O'Connor, and we're missing Peter O'Connor from University of Auckland here. And we're actually missing, where's Lorraine? Oh! And last but not least, we've got Lorraine Kerr, President of NZ Star, the School Trustees Association. So thank you for joining us here tonight, panellists, and look forward to hearing your thoughts on the discussion. So, I think so. As a bit of scene setting, my first interaction with Tomorrow's Schools really began with, I think, thinking back on it, as a student, yes, but more specifically as I was a student rep for Manamatta College Board of Trustees back in 1999, giving my age away. Come full circle now, I'm board chair at my kids' school in Papamoa, the Bay of Plenty. So I have a very vested interest, personally and professionally, in this review, which is why I'm quite excited about tonight and getting this debate underway. So I don't think Tomorrow's Schools review needs a thorough introduction by me in terms of the 8 issues. I think we can assume that we're familiar with those. But where I would like to start this conversation is perhaps what's the problem we're fixing here? Why are we even going into a review process? So perhaps, Bally, if you'd like to start us off with your take on that and where the task force really sat.
Thank you for the introduction. Kia ora, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and really looking forward to the conversations. It's part of the consultation process as far as I'm concerned. Can I check that you can hear me back there? Good, because I drop off sometimes. I don't mean that literally. So I think what I would say first of all is this review is a once in a generation opportunity to actually look at the schooling system, the compulsory schooling system, and I think that's something we should do. Actually, we haven't done it properly since 1989. So it's important that we, as a country, look at the system and look at how it's working and what we can do to improve it. So this is the first point. I think the second point, and it's something that I don't want to labour because I think probably everybody gets it. As a system, if we look at how we are performing, if you look at some of the big benchmark statistics, the international benchmark statistics, some of our data is plateauing, declining, and that's the academic as well as a lot of the well-being indicators. Perhaps most importantly, we face as a country a significant equity issue, and the gap between those who are performing well and not performing as well as we would like is significant. It's large, as you know probably. It's one of the largest in the OECD, and it is stubborn. And the ability of the schooling system to address that gap that we think we need to do a lot more work to address that gap. So the last thing I would say, I'm going on over, the last thing I would say in terms of the wider review, our view is, the task force review, is that the system that we set up in 1989, although it's delivered some good stuff, that the system of 2,500 almost atomized boards of trustees that are having to reinvent the wheel and work on their own, with some support, yes, but generally work on their own, does not provide the mechanism to scale up change, to ensure that innovation is systemized and makes a difference to all our students. And I think that if you put that package together, there's a really good reason for this review.
Can I ask the panel any thoughts on Dali's summary of the challenges we're facing as a system?
I think I would say that I'd agree with the points that Bali has highlighted, but also we have an increasing diversity within our student population, and I guess it's that ability to be able to actually meet their needs and have the resourcing that is appropriate to meet their needs over time is really, really important. So systemically, we're just not doing that. We talk about inequity, and until we actually can find a way forward around ensuring that every child gets what they need to support them so that they have the best learning outcomes possible, then we're a long way off that.
So do the education hubs, as outlined in the report, are they one way of tackling this problem? Peter, what do you think?
Well, I think the process of decentralising and making schools autonomous business units, which is what sat really at the heart of the Tomorrow Schools reforms, have been pernicious in the impact that it's had on generations of young New Zealanders. School reinforces the inequality, so it's not just about student achievement, it's about the fact that you have schools that are winners and we have schools that are losers. It's not schools who are winners or losers, we have children who are in those places who are winners and losers, and in fact sometimes the difference is as short as 2 to 3 kilometres away. So you have children in some schools with everything they need and $1,000 worth of donations going in, and apparently that's not enough, and other schools with mould and rot and principals battling to work out whether or not they fix that or employ a teacher aide because those are the kinds of issues that they've had to deal with. So Tomorrow's Schools is not just about, for me, lifting achievement. It's actually getting rid of something which has increased the class divide in this country in a way which is hard to imagine if you go back to 1989.
One of the main concerns, though, that we're hearing is, you mentioned winners and losers, and I mean, what do you say to the winners who are saying, but our school, our board's operating just fine, why break a system that works when we need to fix the problems of the rest?
Well, the whining squeal of the privilege is always difficult to deal with, and I think we've had quite a bit of that since the introduction of the report. You know, on my Facebook page today, I've been directing a play by a theatre company in Auckland of homeless people. And so on my Facebook page are all these images of mainly Māori men sleep on the street. And then in the bit underneath it, I got invited to a public meeting being chaired by David Seymour. And the image of the young people in that spoke so clearly about this issue, that there's a privileged class who are going to kick and fight back because they have been the winners and they don't want to lose the advantage.
Comment later. When you're ready.
Pardon?
I'll make a comment when you're ready.
Yep. Do you want
just to add to what you're saying, though, I think the challenge is, I think partly is one of clarity of message. The report, I mean, I applaud the report. I think it's really, really bold and fresh, and it's if you're ideologically inclined to see the inequity that we've already spoken to, then the report, I think, in many ways really sings to you. But if you can't see your own school or your own context in the report, or if you happen to be of a different ideological view, then the report falls on deaf ears. And I think although the report has said, and quite rightly, that we need to move away from the political reforming zeal and the to and fro that comes every time we change government, but I think it's the ideology behind. I mean, it pulls no punches in terms of having a really strong view around putting the child first and the inequity that exists. But I think we also have to acknowledge that not everybody shares that view in terms of what is the right way to approach social change. And so that's the challenge here with reading the report rather than interpreting the solutions, I think.
Lorraine, did you want
Jude, if I was to go back to the why do it, I guess the biggest thing is why not, for all the reasons Peter's talking about. And I have to say there are many things that have been said so far that I agree with. And no, this is not a mutual admiration society, but I do agree that it needs to be looked at, whatever it is. If you ask the question about the hubs, let's not assume at all that there will be hubs. It's only a proposal. But the conversations that are happening have assumed that the hub system will be what it is. And if it is, then that's another conversation that needs to be had. Now, Barley's comment about, and I'm not sure whether he made reference to this, but he talked about boards of trustees not being provided with the mechanism to scale up change. Well, actually, change happens to everyone, and it's not just about the board of trustee system that possibly needs change. One of the biggest things that would worry me about the report, and I absolutely agree with change, is that it's not just about shifting the deck chairs, that it's not just about disestablishing the ministry, disestablishing ERO, disestablishing NZQA, and then putting them all in the hubs. That's just shifting the deck chairs. And with that notion, if we're going to do that, then my biggest worry is we'll get what we've always got. So one of the things I think we actually all need to do is consider how we can unlearn and relearn for that change to happen.
Can I make I think one of the things that this report does is, you're right, it puts out a challenge to this country. And when the task force wrote it, we were very clear in our minds that this was about really big transformational change in the way we view schooling and cultural change in the way we run the schooling system. And I want to connect up a couple of points that were made. One of the points that you made was that some schools who feel that they're doing all right want to be left alone. It seems to me that I get that, but it's actually sort of a product of the conditioning of the last 30 years. That what we've got is a situation where all the drivers point to this. You must look after your school and your community, and there's nothing wrong with that. But what we've got is a situation where it's becoming almost to the exclusion of our communities as a whole. It's become my school rather than our schools, my community rather than our communities. So that's the first point I would make. And that's a big deal, I think, after 30 years of Tomorrow's Schools with messages to everybody, to students, to teachers, to principals, to say, no, we are a small country with huge capacity of resource, and we need better ways to collaborate together. Because if we don't, what we've talked about here in terms of the inequities, and the polarisation of our communities, we will all pay for down the track where we already are. So that's the first point I would make. The second point I would make is actually something like a hub is central to our proposals. Because what we need is a mechanism, as I've said, to scale up. Simply working with individual schools and individual boards to get systems change is unlikely to work. However, something like a hub, and this is not unusual in other jurisdictions. It's not unusual. It's not radical. So something like a hub, which provide support for teachers, professional development for teachers, professional leadership advice for principals, business support for boards of trustees, to us seems a bit of a no-brainer, to be honest.
Do you envisage the hubs being some flexibility in the proposals? What do you say to the idea of supporting boards to varying degrees? So I've heard one suggestion that the hubs might be an opt-in, a voluntary process. So a board that's firing along on all cylinders might not need as many of the hub services, while another board might need a lot of help. What do you think of the flexibility? I'm open to ideas if anyone's. Linda.
So one of the things I was going to actually before bring up the point around that cultural shift from my school to our schools and that whole focus in on collaboration. And one of the things that we've got at the moment is we have got huge distrust in the sector at the moment that comes through, and I think is signalled within the report itself. And in order to actually shift into a place where there's opportunities to share skills and expertise of our leaders, our teachers, our people who can actually work from that my school to our school space is going to be, I think, very, very significant. And I guess the jury's out on whether we call something hugs or whether we call them roses or we call them whatever we call them. But what I see as being, and what we see as being envisaged within the report is a really strong support service closest to the school itself. So quite different from what we have had over the last 30 years. And there's been morphing. For some people, they'll remember back to what the education boards were like. And I've had people who've said, shock, horror, we're not going back into that space, are we? Well, no, we don't want to send away and ask for 3 gun staplers and some metre rolls or whatever. We don't want to be in that space, but what we know we do need is we do need to have support closest to the child, closest to the school, easily accessible, and we need to redevelop the trust that has been lost from without the sector.
But if we remove it from the my school to our schools, are we not at risk of diminishing that community involvement, that parent buy-in to it? And Lorraine, I'm particularly interested in your views on this.
Yes and no. That's a cop-out statement, isn't it?
Yeah,
it is. I don't believe we are diminishing the community
by moving to the hubs.
by moving to the hubs at all. Let's face it, every parent has an opinion about their children and their education, and that's not going to go away. And so that's kind of the strength of the community engagement stuff that the report talks about. I don't believe from my to our will diminish that at all. In fact, we talk about communities as if they're little pods. Actually, communities are bigger than that. And within a community are several schools, not just 1 or 2. So, no, I actually...
But we're talking about 115 schools or so, aren't we, or the hubs? I mean, that's quite a different concept to a few.
Excuse me, I'd actually argue that some schools and boards of trustees, and you'll know this, I guess, in NZ Star, there are providing the Pacifica, the disabled representation on any of those boards and actively included in those communities. So immigrant, migrant is not actively recruited. And it is give and take, but say a community hub, you could actually have a list of, I suppose, more active people if you needed migrant resources and things like that to feed into the boards of trustees, because most of these community groups don't have the access to their boards of trustees or the knowledge and skill set that's typically seen and required of board of trustees.
I'd also like to add to the point is that because the boards are voted by the parents who are currently in the school, they can at times end up, the school that is not representing its community either. There are specific examples where that has occurred.
And again, perhaps that's where part of the system needs the change. Because no matter how we try to, with best endeavours, have representation on the board, democracy takes over in terms of the vote. I know there's always the option to co-opt, but often these very people we talk about don't want a bar off of that actual system of being on the board and making these decisions and working out what the role is really about. Because I do know it takes a member of the community a minimum of 18 months to come to grips with the role of the board, even with what the acronyms mean. So,
Still getting there. Karen.
Would it be fair to say that boards are predominantly white and typically male? Maybe something else, but not. But I'm just saying in terms of who we see as the worthwhile skill set to put on those boards. And what
it actually depends on the area. I couldn't answer you. That would depend on the area. If you were looking at Middle Auckland, it may well be. But if you were looking in Manukau, no. If you were looking in Thames, it may well be. In Taupo, yes it is. So it depends on the area as to whether it is typically. I don't believe it is typically, but yeah.
Karen, did you want to add something
I
on?
was just going to, I mean, the discussion around the role of boards has spun off from the discussion around education hubs. And I think like you were saying, Barley, you can't, the hubs are the central part from which the other recommendations fall. And one of the issues that we've just started to debate around the makeup of boards and how much work it is to be on a board and how long it takes to be part of a board and whether you think you feel represented by your board. There are other recommendations, I think, in the report that seek to change some of the pressures, maybe alleviate some of the things that actually are disincentives to being part of that process, to change the way parent engagement might look with a school. And so the interconnected, I don't think we can just talk about the hubs in isolation because there are a whole raft of things around resourcing and the equity funding index and so on that actually would also shift the way that those communities work.
And I think if we get back to the philosophical underpinning of tomorrow's schools, it was about setting schools off adrift in many ways on their own. And so the support structures that sat there in the 1980s were dismantled. And so the hubs are about addressing an issue where many schools were and are adrift. And how you actually begin to work on that at a systems level is actually, I think, what the review attempts to do. It's saying you can't treat schools as competing businesses which market and sell. When I came in from the airport today, I was stuck in the traffic as people were shopping for schools for their children, and that's the impact in Auckland and in Wellington. People are driving their kids all over the place, so this notion of the importance of the community and the schools has been shattered by other things which have been happening as well with the zoning issues.
You've been very patient.
I've got a question and I would like the panel's response. Am I right if I read in this report that one of the key factors, and something that hasn't been mentioned, is to shift system leadership to educational professionals away from bureaucrats? Or do I read it wrong?
That sounds like one for you.
Am I right if what I read in this is an attempt to shift system leadership away from bureaucrats and to educational professionals?
I'd say, yeah, that's a good summary. One of the things I talk about so much, it's the trouble. I think one of the problems we have in the way we've set up the system, and ministry people are probably here, so I hope I'm getting, I went and talked to ministry people, and one of the things they said was that the system is set up so the decision-making points in the system is set up so that they can't actually influence schools because the rules don't make it easy for them to do that. That's the first point. Second point is that's why schools get frustrated. So what we've got is a bureaucratic system where the drivers are going in different ways. Ministry's trying to do stuff, the system doesn't let it happen. And the third point I was making is exactly that. What we see with the hubs is the profession beginning to take back education. We see the opportunity, for example, in hubs, for principals to move into hubs in leadership positions and then come out of hubs. We see the opportunity of teachers going in and providing their expertise and coming out. There's some business stuff that needs to go on, yes, but there's an opportunity here to make something really unique for New Zealand. So a system where we acknowledge community, and our proposals are around giving boards of trustees a role which we believe they actually want and can do. My prediction, by the way, if this goes ahead, is that there'll be more people standing for boards of trustees under our proposed system than currently. But giving that over there, and then through the hubs, providing the leadership and the advice and the business support for schools which they desperately need.
Lorraine Meeks, Springboard Trust. Congratulations and thank you for a wonderful report. Our question would be of the hub is, can you help us think through how the hub will perform both the monitoring and evaluation role, as well as the assistance and supporting of school leaders?
Yes, Barley.
Okay, thank you for that question. I just want to make sure. I think it's a really good question, and my answer is twofold. Firstly, the current way we evaluate schools, in our view, using the ERO processes, in our view, it does not work. A 3-year event-based review process, which then leaves the support process to somebody else, which is actually not connected up with the system, is a nonsense. And actually what it does, in our view, is drive all sorts of funny behaviours in schools. You know, every 3 years or 5 years. If you get a 5-year, you're good. You know, if you get a 1 year, you're bad. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would say is, we believe if education hubs and the people working in those education hubs are close enough to schools, and that's a key thing, who know what's happening in schools, who are daily involved with principals and talking about the potential problems, helping share ideas, identifying good stuff that's going on and spreading it. If that constant flow between school and hub is going on, the review process is happening. The review process is happening, and I don't buy that you've got to separate review and audit and support. I don't buy that. Let's start treating our teachers and principals as professional people who want to do the very best for the children in their school, who have an interest in social justice, and let's support them to do that. And I think we'll get much better behaviours if we go down that track than a compliance approach, which is currently what we have.
Is there not a risk for some inconsistency creeping in there, though, that the schools are only as good as their hub, the different hubs having different standards?
It's not a perfect world, but do we have consistency now?
Right.
I mean,
fair point.
so we get hung up on measurement. It's all got to be. So yeah, education is a messy business.
Yeah.
We need to make sure we put some tools into place to make sure hubs are consistent across the country. We accept that. But what we're talking about is a sort of an organic process of working in schools, with schools, to improve student outcome. There's a hard line here, because one of the things we've said in our report is once we have got good indicators, academic, well-being, when we've got those good academic indicators and good well-being indicators, we see no problem in those indicators being put on a website that people can see.
Karen, I see you nodding away with that area. You wouldn't be sorry to see that go and replaced with the model that the task force is proposing?
No, well, I've seen examples exactly of what you've talked about, where, in fact, I've been through the Euro experience myself, and there is that momentary disappointment when they say it's not going to be 5 years, it's going to be 4, and you think,
I failed.
And there's that moment of you feel like you've failed some kind of test, when really It's supposed to be, if you were to have a similar system all the way through from how we think about review and feedback for young people, then the same goes through a really healthy appraisal system, and then that appraisal system should be reflected in how we review our schools, and it should be something that is cyclical and formative and related to what's happening on the ground in almost a real-time process. So, there was a suggestion in the report around sampling, around people coming into school and being much closer to what's happening for the students rather than necessarily making judgments just on documentation. So I really liked the light touch sampling idea with people who know the school rather than brace for the inspection that's coming and everything pivots around that and the school comes to
Linda, I imagine you'd agree with that.
Totally. I'm just nodding at what I'm hearing really, because I too have been through ERO reviews and actually, it's been in many ways it's been a good experience, but actually it's come out with confirming what we already knew. And because I'm in a school which is largely children with English as second language, then we never quite got to the national standards, so we were never going to get a 4 to 5 year review anyway. And yet there was amazing things happening within the school that I never really had the opportunity to really share, because actually the reviewers didn't go into the classrooms, or if they did, it was only into 1 or 2, and they would read documents, and I would want to talk about the children and the growth in that child, that special needs child who actually had gone from here to here but wasn't there. And those were the stories that I wanted to tell and never had the opportunity to do it.
Peter, what are your thoughts on the structural changes being proposed with the proposed introduction of the evaluation office?
The shifts and the impact that will have in the developments in the ministry, I think, are vital. Trying to find an education specialist in the ministry is like trying to find a crew member on the Marie Celeste. It's really difficult, and that's, I think that's a reality for many people in schools, to have that shift and to bring ERO, NZQA into the one building with the ministry will make an enormous difference. To actually have people in the ministry who aren't just counting, but are looking at what really matters in our system will be a significant shift for schools, will be a significant shift for us in New Zealand.
I think there are a large number of complexities, and if we're talking hubs, there's lots of things in there that will be complex, and that's what we need to be looking at. And what we really need to be doing is thinking about why we're doing this. And I say we, the adults in the system, why are we doing this? And who are we doing this for? That's often a question we forget, because we have, how many, 750,000 students out there who are reliant on those of us who are here, and many more like us. Anyway.
Can I just pick up on that? I'm really curious about the size of the problem. Peter, at the beginning you described the problem in terms of winners and losers. It's very binary. I'm a winner or a loser. I would suggest that there's probably more of a bell curve. And as a Board of Trustee chair, I'm concerned that the vast majority in the middle, I'm guessing.
Depends on where you are on the bell curve, I guess.
Yeah, so can you talk to the size of the problem? How many
we know 1 in
losers?
4 New Zealand children go to school hungry. We know that, that they go cold in the winter. We know that there are a whole range of problems, and we know that the single largest impact on what happens in schools is what kids bring to school rather than what happens at school. So when we talk about the winners and losers, we can talk about what happens at school to those 200,000 if we have a system which is around competing business units where they're going to schools which are impoverished, where it's really difficult for them to find people with the expertise and knowledge to be on those boards to drive the kinds of things that are needed for those young people. So you might be right. I'm not too sure exactly what the bell curve looks like, but if you're a loser, it is pretty binary.
But I guess to jump,
on everybody else, the risk to everybody else. I mean, I think we can all agree that a different strategy and perhaps more resource will make the biggest difference to those at the unfortunate, the undesirable end of the curve. But I'm in the risk management business, and I perceive a massive risk to everybody else by applying this blunt instrument to everybody.
By redistributing the resources, essentially, which is what a lot of this is about, I guess I'd agree that a lot of schools are fearful that they will lose out. And it doesn't speak to, the recommendations don't speak to them, is what I'm hearing from various schools.
I've just got a question. How big is the size of the problem? Because that wasn't revealed in the report. So my concern is that the report comes to various conclusions based on which kind of flows on with from your comment really. Risk management, blunt instrument, how big is the size of the problem? Lots of rhetoric.
I think the problem, there are a couple of problems I think we need to address. One is, as I said at the beginning, if you look at the international data around performance of the system, then you can see plateauing and declining in academic areas, and you can see a real problem in well-being. And just look at some of the UNICEF data. So that's overall there is an issue. In terms of the equity, if you look at things like the gap in reading, for example, between those the size of the gap is enormous across this country.
So those were the things you laid out at the start.
Yeah.
But the starting point of the previous person's question was, are we not simply talking about perhaps a different strategy and more resources?
Let me address. I'd like to address.
Sure.
Because that's also a case around opt-in, opt-out. That effectively, let's leave it alone and address the issue of those students that are not served by the system. So let's address that. So the debate really here is around, to what extent does the system, the way the system is set up, actually drive the continuation of those inequalities? And we think it does. Because if you set up a system where schools are independent, and you set up a system where they are asked to compete, and you set up a system where you don't provide adequate support, then what is going to happen is the system is going to create losers. And so long as that system continues without an evening process, that inequity will be very stubborn, will be very difficult to address, and we will all, as I said before, end up paying for it.
Excuse me, Barney, that answer actually feeds into what I've been wondering about, which is how much of these issues that you talk about, and you'll be aware of the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. So let's just say, just because it happens now doesn't mean that boards of trustees versus hubs are the reason for things going wrong. But to what extent are the issues that you identify a result of the system design being inappropriate? And to what extent is it a result of the things you've just talked about, inadequate support, inadequate resourcing, in other words, the implementation of those ideas?
But doesn't one connect with the other?
They connect, but they're not necessarily the same.
Well, I mean, I suppose the argument is, why would you have a system, if you agree with them, why would you have or continue with a system that generates inequity?
So,
and then you have to deal with it.
Let me ask you another question then. In what way can you be sure that an under-resourced hub system will not have exactly the same problems that an under-resourced Board of Trustees system has?
I'll answer that. But no answer. And the resourcing, of course, is a big issue. I suppose that I'll use learning support, perhaps, as an example. Learning support disability. The system is pretty broken at the moment. I think we'll all agree with that. And the system needs more resourcing. We'll all agree with that. But what's also missing is a coherent delivery mechanism. That's a systems problem. We don't have one. Well, I don't think we have one. And you see, to me, it's like straightforward logic to say, well, like other jurisdictions around the world, we need to create something that helps us do that delivery.
And bearing in mind that some of those other jurisdictions have just gotten rid of their district education boards because they're not providing consistent results.
But I'm absolutely sure that when they've got rid of this, they've created something else to provide that support.
What they've done is just made it all the business of the Department of Education.
Well, in other words, what they haven't done is to say, in our case, in 1989, I know there have been some developments. Okay, guys, you're on your own. We didn't. That's not usual, and it's not done anywhere else in the world. So we've got to put ourselves in the context of saying, well, actually, yeah, this is a messy business with the measurement and the post-hoc, all of that stuff I get. But the logic would dictate that since we have a system that generates inequities, we need not only to resource it properly to deal with that, but we try to deal with the inequities in the first place, if we can. We need to do both. Can I just say one other thing, because it's part of what you're saying? It's that opt-out, opt-in thing. The school's saying, we're okay, we don't need to be part of the system. And I think, and as I said before, it's a bit of a symptom of the problem. But there's all sorts of complexities in there, because there's no we're good, we're not good. There's a spectrum of schools that go right across that, how you define good and bad. And they move up and down, and they shift when boards change and principals change, and all this stuff happening. It's a dynamic system. And I think if we create a dual system whereby we say, well, you're okay and you can be accredited to do this, we set up a whole lot of new bureaucracy and measurement and polarisation. Goodness me, we're less than 5 million people.
Got a few hands. First of all, love the report, love reading it, read it several times, so good job. But my question really is, I'm in a state integrated school, so I wonder how it's going to fit for us and what are the advantages for a state integrated school that I think does not get resourced in the way that it should, which might not be your problem, but where do you see that fitting?
Would anyone like to take thoughts on that? State integrated schools?
I'd like to agree with you.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure there is the level of understanding under the Integrated Act in terms of how you operate versus what the report is suggesting. Even if we look at, and I'm sorry, my area, which is boards of trustees and boards of trustees in integrated schools, this is talking about removing property. Actually, I'm not sure we can do that in integrated schools, given you are the property owner.
Yeah.
So that will need to be ironed out.
Leonie.
So just going back to the risk analysis and things like that, there's currently 176,000 children and young people at a minimum with disabilities in schools, and they are significantly underfunded and unresourced, as are the schools and teachers who are meant to be providing for them. So if you look at the international research on cost-benefit analysis, for every $1 you invest in a person with a disability, you actually get, at minimum from the research I found, a $3.5 return on that. So actually, you're actually looking at reducing the risks going forward by better resourcing teachers. And I'm just talking about 176,000 kids, let alone every single teacher who's desperately trying to figure out how to cope with the whole range without the appropriate supports. But I figure a $3.5 return for every dollar invested in a long-term future project for our society and the well-being is actually a pretty good risk assessment.
I think we'd all agree that resourcing is probably the number one issue. That if I'm not an educator, I've worked alongside educators for 20 years, but I'm not an educator. I think we could probably agree that what happens in the classroom is the most important thing, and that's about capability and resourcing in terms of do I have enough adults doing the training. But the point you've made there is, I think it's great that dollars is the main issue. Going from hubs to boards, that's deck chair stuff, to be honest. If we can rearrange the deck chairs, but if we don't do that, we won't get the answer.
But not absolute dollars either, because on your point recently, the healthy homes standards that were released on the weekend, for every dollar spent in making our homes healthier, we get a $6 return in the health system and in other social systems. So this is the problem. Where do we as taxpayers put our investment for the best return? It might actually be, and I'm not saying it is, but it might be that Scandinavian approach. You start feeding kids in schools to solve some of those equity issues and get some educational benefit out of it. It might mean that, you have to actually look into the homes and do some things there, because if you're going to solve equity issues, you're not just going to solve them in schools, and that might not be where you get the best return on your dollar.
Brian Rabbit, who was the Education Secretary in the United States under Bush, you want to really make a difference in education outcomes? Have kids who are fed. And it's as simple as that.
Hi, thank you for raising that point about feeding kids in schools. So I've been studying my master's in Finland on this particular issue, and it was incredible to see every single child, no matter what their background was, be able to come in and have a full, nutritious meal and sit down with their teachers who are eating the same thing. And the impact that has had on reducing the relationship between family background on academic outcomes and also their life opportunities. And I see this Education Hub's proposal as being an opportunity for something like this to happen in New Zealand. It's universal, that's centralised and supported by the central government, and not this totally inadequate piecemeal approach that we have to kids in schools. Now, in education, we can't fix things around housing issues or salaries, but we can, if we look to the Finnish model, use schools as a way to distribute food. And as Peter said before, 1 in 4 kids are going hungry. This is absolutely unacceptable in a place like New Zealand that is so bountiful, where a place like Finland, which struggles to grow food, are able to feed all of their kids, and it has a really strong impact on education outcomes. And my question is, I looked through the report and I couldn't see anything about feeding kids in schools. Since the new government's come in, I haven't seen anything that they've said about food in schools, and I wonder if that was part of a discussion of the task force.
Are the education hubs, do they present an opportunity to have a more joined up system and work with other agencies and ministries to bring into some of these systems and shared services? What do we think?
Certainly one of our recommendations is, I think the word we used was that the hubs will provide an opportunity to hardwire some of the other agencies together. So you might talk about health and housing, the key ones, and you hardwire those into the hub. I don't know my experience, I live in New Plymouth, and what I keep hearing is community groups working really hard to alleviate poverty and deprivation in the city. And without exception, they always tell us that they can't get the agencies to work together. So there's that constant churning around trying to get something happening across the agencies. And I suppose we would see the hubs as an opportunity to pull that thinking together, but perhaps most importantly to be child-based. So this is around social justice for our children, fundamentally.
Yes.
How do you envisage the kahuiakos working with the proposed hubs?
So, would anyone, Rebecca, do you want to take that one? Karen, would you like to? Is your school part of a COL?
Yes, and I'm the lead for
Right.
our capital city kahuiako. We're quite a new one compared to others that have been established a few years ago. And it was interesting to see that the report suggested that there was still something interesting and worth looking at. We talked a while ago about how the report's proposals were a shift from me to us, but actually that willingness to group together around kind of hyper-local concerns, which is really what the kahuiako, the communities of learning, are doing. If you think about in Wellington region, we've got about 250 schools, but within that you have got groups of much smaller communities. We've got 8 in ours, the one down the road, we've got 5 schools and so on. The schools grouping together around hyper-local concerns, but if you had a hub, the reach to groups of schools, the understanding of what's happening in those smaller communities within that larger region, it becomes logistically more manageable, but it supports the collaboration and networking practices that we've talked about trying to scale. So partly there's an advantage in terms of thinking about reach and how you reach individual schools that are already collaborating and connected. But I think there are another mechanism for understanding deeply what is happening in smaller sections of a larger community. So I do think there are still issues with the policy. We're not here to debate that. But I think there's enough there. Do I sound like I've got a vested interest in actually? There's enough there to keep them going quite a little bit longer while we look to see what the downstream impact is likely to be.
Thank you.
I think it's probably the conversation, this conversation is the conversation that should have happened before the IES policy was ever announced. And I think, because this really has collaboration underpinned throughout it, which is what you were talking about there, Karen. And I think moving forward, if we are wanting to really underpin collaboration in the system, then we'll need to look at the ways that we're going to do that systemically. At the moment, we can look at some very good kahuiako, and we can look at some mediocre kahuiako that aren't making a difference for many children at all, and we can look at a number in the middle. And what we're talking about, hopefully here, is a system shift around collaboration, which is actually a little different.
It seems to me that at the very heart of this report, we're talking about a cultural shift away from thinking that everything in the world is about the individual and your success in life is about you as an individual person, but that we actually survive and flourish and thrive as a nation, as a group of 5 million people. And that, if you go back to, just thinking of 1999 and Labour Party manifesto, they talked about winner and loser schools. That was the language that they used. That it was, if you don't succeed, that's because that's how the market works. And there were those crazy 1980s, 90s days where, it was all about, let the market sort it out. And we know how disastrous that's been for the country, aren't we? Haven't we sort of gone past that? And sort of fixing some of the excesses of that in tomorrow's schools is absolutely vital.
Lorraine, you wanted to add?
And I think if we go back to the time you're talking about, I believe David Longy was quoted as saying that competition would lead to excellence. But in the same breath, failure is not an option. And so the system has struggled with how do we produce excellence, and how do we stop failing and help us. So that's been part of the struggle that we've had. In terms of the kahuiako and the notion of collaboration, there are kahuiako communities of learning out there that are doing a really good, a damned good job in terms of the intent of that whole thing. However, and maybe I'll be blunt here to say that's a National Party initiative. Will it survive this review? That's all I'm going to say here.
It's a good, we've got one of our readers, we asked, prior to this, we asked our wider reader audience for questions, and the first one to come in was actually this one. What will happen to these reforms if Labour is not returned in the next election? So I mean, what are we moving past education being a political football that we've heard so much with this report? Is that where we're heading with this, do you think?
I think we'd all love that to happen. We've seen over the last few years a number of policies that have been quite divisive, and actually what we do need to see is that when something comes in and when there's a critical mass of people who believe that this is the right way forward for education in this country, then actually a critical mass of our people in this nation say this is the way to go, then actually no politician should come in and try and change it. And that's the space that that this country, in my view, needs to be in, really. And we see what Finland did. They managed to get an agreement around a bipartisan move forward for the education system. We've had 2 summits, and that was sort of small, really, but it did give an indication of what people felt the vision for education in this country should be and what should underpin education in this country. Well-being came out top, creativity, innovation, risk-taking. You didn't see anything like measurement and accountability in the forms that we've had it. So we actually really need to listen to what people are saying they want our education system to look like and feel like and be like, and have that critical mass of people who can actually really take it forward, because it's not about politics. Well, it shouldn't be about politics.
If you historically, we had a real consensus for generations before 1989. So if we go back to the 1937 debates, which actually were incredible. Thousands and thousands of people came to listen and to talk about how schools could be. Peter Fraser and Clarence Beebe set up progressive education, and it was cross-party. That's how we did it. And in 1989 we just tipped it all up on its head, and in fact there was no consultation, as I remember. We just kind of like, boom, here it is. That's how I remember 1989.
Maybe they'll be talking about this in years to come.
Well, and I think maybe, it's huge, Barney, that there is this consultation which happens. I'm somewhat distressed by some of the, policies which talk from the National Party that were back to charter schools, national standards, and, God almighty.
Charlie.
So you might be interested in the task force's view on this, because what we did was, before we wrote the recommendations, we went and saw Nikki Kay, I think 4 times, and we talked to her education corpus, and we had really, good discussions. They were up front with what they thought was important. We actually had a debate with her, and we actually picked up some of her ideas in our report, and we felt that was really, really good. I think the reaction to the report. You will be aware that the National Party is running these roadshows, and I think there's some discussion. What Nikki Kay has said is that she likes lots of the report, and there's bits of the report she doesn't like, particularly this debate around the relative responsibilities of Board of Trustees and hubs. And that's a debate that we should have. We talked to Chloe Swarbrick, we talked to David Seymour, we talked to Tracy Martin. And every time we went to those people, we said, this has got to be cross-party, this has got to be non-partisan, this has got to be non-partisan. And, I sort of worry at the moment that we might be losing that opportunity. And I'm going to be a bit bold here, if I may.
Please.
Because it seems to me the way we get this non-partisan is by people, and I mean you guys, writing to Nikki Kay and Chris Hipkins and David Seymour and saying, we've had enough of this. We've had enough of this political football stuff, and we want you to stop. Here's a report. You may disagree about it, but put your heads together and pull something together you can both agree on. And let's get this thing on the road. And they will not do it unless we make them, because they're politicians and they're tribal. And my invitation to people as I'm going around the country is to write that down.
And it's a little ironic to have, I guess, political initiatives that are promoting collaboration within the education system when they themselves don't look at them.
I'd like to turn the conversation now to drill down into some aspects of the report, and specifically you mentioned leadership was one of them. I'm particularly interested in Linda and Karen's views on this. It's the 5-year principal contracts clause in there. Will these contracts keep school leadership fresh, or are they unsettling for schools and principals and their communities? What's your view on it? Linda, let's start with you as a principal.
Okay, so I don't think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Barley, that the task force ever meant for it to be a 5-year contract where suddenly you shifted from your school and you went somewhere else. I think and it has come up a lot in conversations that I've been a part of. the concept is around, and it goes back to that culture shift that we're talking about. The shift from my school to our schools, the conversation with hubs, roses, whatever we want to call them, around with the leadership advisors around what your growth is as a principal, as a leader, what opportunities there are across the hub, and where you may fit, where your skills, your expertise, your wisdom may actually serve a community well, but also serve your own professional growth. So I think it's one of those myths that's been that's there that I don't think was meant to be quite that line in the sand. And so that's the sort of conversation that we're having, I guess, at the moment. And it is that shift for thinking in a different way, rather than thinking that we have to be in these boxes. For some people, 5 years would be ideal. For my school that I've been in as a principal in Auckland, 5 years would not have cut the mustard. I would have needed much, much longer to shift some spaces in that place. And that's the conversation that I would be wanting to have with a trusted person within the hub or rose.
No, I'm inclined to agree. I mean, I think the challenge around the 5-year contract, it masks the intent, which was how do we ensure that the school stay fresh and connected to those professional learning opportunities, and that there's a chance for review in situations where a principal is not quite cutting the mustard. I mean, I can imagine, like you say, I mean, you know, how long is a piece of string? It depends what's happening in a school. 5 years is quite a short turnaround for many schools if there are a number of issues to tackle. And I also think that having a set contract time can create perverse incentives, such as, you know, think about someone who might be in an acting role, people who've acted up as a principal, you know, you're going to get people who may not necessarily want to push through a whole load of change because they know they've only got 5 years to do it and they're not going to see it through. Perversely, you'll get some keen bean who thinks, right, I've got 5 years, watch me change the school. And, you know, we've all worked with people who are keen. So I think there's, it's trying, just like you're saying, it's trying to keep the focus on actually what do we want for a modern leader in a school, a really healthy review and support system, kind of like the thing that Springboard Trust does for leaders around the country, you know, making sure that they're connected to current practice and making sure there's a mechanism to help leaders who, for whatever reason, are maybe not yet quite serving the community.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I think everybody said it. I would add that I think that's one of the bits of the report that we could have written better. I think the recommendation is not clear enough. I think our intent has been explained here. It's something we're going to have a look at in our next write-up.
Right.
Can I ask a question on that as well? It just he's focused on principles shifting around, which I actually think is a good idea. But I wondered whether, in your thinking, you were also imagining the situation because the person would be permanently appointed and employed by the hub.
Yep.
Whether in fact it could be the situation where a DP comes out, goes to be a principal for 5 years, and then actually moves back to a DP position because they decide that, you know, they find that they don't like the principal's role or for whatever reason. Is that the kind of thing you want?
Absolutely. I think it's got to be a osmosis, I suppose. It's got to be a process where people feel free to move around the system. You're absolutely right, and that also applies to teachers. That, you know, and this is sort of by mutual agreement. What goes round comes round. So a teacher moving to another school, as long as the principal agrees, learning something, somebody else comes in, you're growing the deputies, you're doing all this good stuff for the system. And we've sort of lost that because we've got, as has been said, we've got wedded to, you know, this is my place and I'm not shifting.
Also, just for me, I'm not speaking on behalf of my association. but for me, when I look at issues like this, I think, what's the behaviour of the change? Whose behaviour is it? How do we change it? And tomorrow's schools was very good at changing principal behaviour in particular in a certain way. And for me, the notion that within a hub of 150, well, you know, let's say secondary schools, and we're talking 20 secondary schools, that you could end up being the principal in any one of those schools during your career, is certainly going to change the way that you think about how you treat the other schools in that hub while you're principal.
It's a moral responsibility.
So,
personally, I think our current system is basically nothing but ridiculous. Because we all know that principals are probably the biggest element or driver of change and improvement within the school. They can play a massive role in that. And as the challenges that schools changes, there's no way at the moment that the system can actually help or support a school, other than basically go and fire somebody and destroy their career simply because they are not at the right place at the right time. So we need to find a way where we're far more flexible and actually helping schools to get the right people in the right place at the right time.
One criticism I have heard, well, not criticism as such, but it's from principals saying about the impact on their families and teachers were being moved around, and I think there's some concerns out there around that.
I think Linda said that you know, what our vision here is, we will get, I don't think anybody is saying that you will be moved regardless of you're going to rip up your family and you're going to have to move into that. We're not going there. This is about collaboration, mutual agreement, and working through and having a conversation with a principal, saying what's the next steps and working it out. We would never, if we were saying you're going to move, you must move, that would actually fly in the face of everything else in this report, doesn't it?
Finally, the other point is if you work for any other company, they can send you from Auckland to Invercargill when they wish. We need to get over ourselves that we are so special. We're here to do a job, we've chosen this career, and we need to do it without being hung up about all these things that we think that we are too good to be told to go anywhere.
I'd argue the opposite. I'd argue that because principals and teachers are employed by their community, that accountability at a very close level is baked into the current system. If we disconnect that and make them employed by the hub, we lose that accountability. Because in reality, if a teacher is not performing, there's no ability at a local level for people to exert any influence on them. But when it comes down to it, the hubs are the employers. That's where the buck stops. Boards of trustees will have to say, sorry, we can't do anything about that.
Bali would like to respond.
Lose that accountability.
Can I make a comment on that? Just to be clear, we see boards as being actively involved in the appointments process and having veto power. But that comment that you made, I find that really interesting because I would find it really hard to find a board of trustees that worked with their principal on the basis that we are your employer and we could fire you if we. It doesn't work like that.
Sorry, I might have described it in a clumsy way. I think that's why I use the term baked in. I think it's implied because when our 300 kids arrive each day with their parents, our teachers know who employs them, and they have that intimate responsibility, if that makes sense. Whereas, they want to do a good job because the people who I guess are responsible for their performance management are just there. I think it's what the strength does.
Hang on, 1 second. Carol.
Can I just comment on that? I think I did research on the principal's experience as a board as the employer. And I would say that the board's ability to manage and support a principal and to monitor is wildly variable. Many boards are still highly deferential to the principal, or they go to the other extreme and deal with the principal in a sort of impulsive, erratic, agenda-based way. It's a highly erratic kind of environment for principals to operate in, because you're really only as good, they said to me, as your last board meeting. It doesn't take much to show that. I think the close connection has a lot of negatives as well. And I think one of the real negatives of the Tomorrow's School system has been the unedifying spectacle of board principal disputes in the media on a regular basis. Highly unhelpful to anybody. But because communities think that they control the situation and can vote the principal out, they go to the media and they create the situation. So I think there are some negatives around that.
Absolutely, but I'd also caution against policy development by anecdote. I accept totally that there are...
That's not anecdote. I'll give you the research.
Mel, did you want to say?
Oh, it was just in response to that. Like, just as a teacher, I could not let that go. Just the idea that, I only do a good job because the parents are at the driveway waiting to dash me. I walk out. It's just so, so ridiculous in terms of that. And in terms of being able to manage it, I think actually that closeness can sometimes make it really difficult for boards to performance manage it, particularly boards who don't have those skills, who don't have those HR skills, which a lot of boards don't. And I think you're much more likely, if you have outsourced that, you've got people you can call on to help with it, to be able to have that effective performance management, which is a horrible term to talk about, but managing those teachers who need that additional support to make sure they're doing the best job they personally could. And I think about it, and I'm a visitor from Auckland. I teach at Western Springs College in the Punawa area, which the closest thing to that in Wellington would be Wellington High. It is such a delight to be here today because my last Tomorrow Schools meeting was Nikki Kay's meeting at Auckland Grammar. And you could not get further away from that and hearing people genuinely discussing these things. But having said that, if I knew I could go for a year, maybe 2 years to Auckland Grammar, see what it's like and know that I could come back to my lovely school after, I think that would be really good for me to see what they do there and see what they do there that is good, because we often alienate the other. And I like to think it would be good for them. They could learn some stuff from me too. And that sort of cross-pollination is really powerful. And so I really like that idea within it.
Leonie, I think you had your hand up.
And on the other side of it, not just with principal and board relationship issues, often parents try to deal with the principal or the board and end up with a very toxic relationship. And we have, I'm part of the Abuse, Equity and Education. We have 3,500 families, teachers, Syncos, some principals, Tracy Martin on our Facebook page. And we have actively been trying to collect this research because no one researches what happens to parents when they have a problem within their school and they take it to the board. We have a lot of responses that are less than helpful that result in exclusions, trespass orders, for very little provocation.
Can I totally endorse that? I think that a very, very big gap in our current system, a very big gap in our current system is what happens when the board says, "Oh, we just support our principal, we're dismissing your complaint." There's nowhere to go, and parents are forced to ring the police, all sorts of people. They take a scattergun approach.
So children who are expelled, there is no right to natural justice. Once the board says you're out, there is no apart from judicial review. There is no anything, and it can be on the basis of anything from smoking to severe violence to we can't get support from you for in our school, and so we're struggling.
Let's talk about the learning support provisions in the report for a second. Learning support coordinator in every school is the proposal. Where are they coming from? How's that going to work?
So that's one of the things that we have been wanting, that schools have been wanting for some considerable time. And a learning support coordinator in absolutely every school is absolutely crucial. Currently we call them Syncos often, and there's a debate about the name or whatever, but actually what we need to see are those people who have got training, who are teachers, who are closest to the children within their learning environments, who can actually get the support, navigate support for them, support teachers if needed, support those learning assistants who are going to be working alongside children in whatever the case may be. It is a job at the moment that people are doing on top of other jobs. So we talk about, and I haven't even mentioned teacher workload or teacher shortages at the moment, but one of the things that is really, really making teachers struggle, I guess, are the huge numbers of children who require additional support, and we want to give them additional support. So what we need is a person who works alongside them in the role of the SENCO. At the moment, it's DPs, principals, people who are team leaders, classroom teachers who might get half a day out of the classroom to do a job that actually is a full-time job. So what the report has absolutely picked up on is something that we really, really need in our schools, because we have growing numbers of children who have need, and we want to address those needs. And I just have to say one more thing, and that is around every single teacher and principal in this country and our support staff feel accountable every single day, not because boards of trustees are their employers, but because they care about the kids that they work with and their families. And I think that that's really, anyway, I can get really passionate about that, but I guess I just needed to support Mel and what she said before.
Thanks. I guess the other thing, this in the background of all this, is that the faculty that I work in have lost 30 staff last year in terms of, because there aren't people who want to become teachers. That we have, I think I'm 3 years older than the average age of a secondary teacher, which is I mean, look at me, I think he must be 80. But but I think it's 50. I think it's 57. I mean, it's extraordinary. We have an aging population of teachers. We struggle to find principals. We struggle to put teachers in classrooms because it's not an attractive job for young people, an attractive career to move into. And part of that is systemic. The way in which we've set up schools does not attract young people into them. So we can tinker around the edges, we can do a whole range of things, or we can go, we need to shift this, and it's wholest, bolus change. And I think that's what we need.
Is the elephant in the room with all this, with learning support and teacher workforce, is the elephant in the room not the resourcing? Because if we had enough teachers, enough resourcing to pay for enough teachers so that every teacher could do all the things they want to do with the student, could access all the help they want to get to help them with that student, to get the training they need for themselves to develop, would we be having this conversation? Or is part of the problem that even when you go looking for support, not only in education but in mental health or health sector as well, those people just aren't there?
I think it's picking up on the point made here that tomorrow's schools shifted the culture of schools, you know, in a huge way. Schools are very different now to what they were like in the 1980s. And that's because of that government policy, which was around a central philosophy. And it was a central philosophy of competition, of winners, of losers, of people are responsible for themselves, and you get the state out of the way as much as humanly possible.
It was what Douglas Adam used to refer to as the SEP field, the somebody else's problem field, the only force in the known universe capable of moving a problem from here to the other side of the universe in no time at all.
Can I just follow through on that one? With 2016, PPDA and the Ministry and School Trustees Association, we went round and looked at secondary teacher work life. We did a joint report on it. One of the things we did was to go and talk to principals around the country. We went to Auckland. We had 3 meetings: high decile school principals, mid decile school principals, low decile school principals. And what the low decile school principals told us was, in terms of supply, there was one of the problems that they had was that the middle decile schools pinched their teachers. They came in and offered them better conditions, and they took their most experienced teachers. And then we talked to the middle decile principals, and they said the problem that they had. And we then talked to the high decile school principals, and they said the problem that we've got, those bloody private schools come in and offer. So each of those principals was acting in what was a logical way for their school. They were taking the best from the schools that were less able to compete with them. And what's left behind are the kids who are not getting the most experienced teachers, who are getting narrow curricula, and all that, and all the problems that are associated with that. So again, how do you change the behaviour? You have to change the structure to change the behaviour. I could give you another example: decile funding. Originally intended only for the lowest decile schools. the high decile schools complained, and so it goes right up now to decile 9.
I'd be interested in the panel's thoughts on the equity index funding that's suggested as issue number 7, I think, in the report. Karen, do you view on that?
Yes, I would say yes, please, to the equity index. I mean, you know, it was really telling when it looked at the fact that in other countries, the actual amount of, I think you cited 6% would be like an average level of appropriate funding to support additional resourcing required in schools, and that we are woefully underfunded. I actually think the question, that previous question about, you know, where would the learning services teachers come from is not, I don't think that's the right question. In all parts of this report, you'll say, well, where will the expertise come from? And that's partly because we're trying to imagine creating roles in our current system, and so it has to be that entire systemic view. It's really interesting when we think about the equity index and how, if we look across schools, that the need exists regardless of decile. There's a neat little graphic in here which looks at how the spread of students with additional learning needs can make two schools that look apparently quite different actually really similar in terms of their need. It wouldn't be a new thing. I mean, the idea of an equity index exists already. I mean, you can go and have a look at it. There's a whole bunch of information on education counts around an equity index, which is already applied in the early childhood setting. So it feels fairer. Certainly when I think about the school where I work here in Wellington, which anecdotally, I know we shouldn't kind of, you know, base things on anecdote, but anecdotally has become the kind, in some situations, the kind of magnet school that's talked about here as a school that attracts students with particular learning needs, and that's for a number of different reasons, and yet the funding doesn't follow
take
through.
It from anecdotal, Karen, I think last year there was 87 NCEA level students, and there was a total of, because of course the RTLB funding stops, I think the school was provided with just over 12,000 to fund the supports for those children and young people.
So I really welcomed that particular aspect of the report.
Definitely.
I think that the discussion around decile, I mean, that is a discussion that's happened under National as well as under Labour. I think most people can see that that's had really pernicious negative effects. So I think it's just a case of what will work better.
And I guess one of the things, and I don't mean to be a stickler here, because I absolutely agree with what's being said, but who do we rob to be able to do this? Are we robbing Peter to pay Paul in terms of looking at the whole equity issue? I don't know, maybe just be careful for what we wish for. Because I think someone else mentioned, if you do this, what effect will it have here? And what effect will that have here and here? So,
but Lorraine, to meet the equity approach, we all in privileged positions have to be willing to park our privilege.
And I don't disagree with that either. Yeah.
I think one of the things that is quite clear in the report is that there is more resourcing that is needed in the education system, full stop. And
the report makes that point quite clear.
And I think that's the point that we just need to remember, that we shouldn't be seeing winners and losers. We should be seeing schools getting what they need. I want to make a point that hasn't come up, and I don't want to leave this room without making this point. So I'm going to say it. I am really disappointed that at no stage of this conversation has early learning been a part of this conversation. And if we're thinking about our education system, and we really want to have an education system that works for the children of this nation, we have to have an early learning system that works for them too. So we've had the work on the early learning strategic plan happening, we've had this work happening, but actually I really worry about the alignment between the two. And I've said it at probably every meeting I've been to, so I didn't want to leave it out this time.
Amen.
Any thoughts on that? Was it a consideration in the task force?
Yeah,
looking at the
it wasn't part of
alignment?
Terms of reference limited us somewhat.
Oh, okay.
But one of the things that did happen is that we tried to meet up with the chairs of the various review groups and talk to each other about what they were doing. So there was an attempt to cross-fertilise ideas. But I think probably, Linda, you're right that we need to do more to all the various reviews are going on. I think it's a really good thing that they're going on together actually, but meshing them that's a challenge.
This does segue nicely into one of our reader questions. How will tomorrow's schools interface with tertiary providers going forwards, especially in the trades and employment spaces? So again, that's asking how it all links up. It's obviously top of mind for a lot of people.
I'll add a thought. I mean, it is referenced in maybe they didn't get that far when they were reading the report. There's quite a few references to the importance of making sure that the schooling sector interfaces with tertiary. For example, there's some nice suggestions around the possibility of schooling becoming far more flexible, not funded on full-time, per full-time student, but enabling students to have flexible timetables, flexible time in school. I can think already we've got lots of students at our school who have to negotiate being at our school for some time and then out at Whitireia or Welltech for another part of their timetable, and it feels constraining in the current system, but I think there's a commitment here to allow far more flexible multi-pathway approach, particularly as you get into the upper part of the secondary school system, so that you don't have the university pathway as the privileged one, and you can go to trades if you're not going that way, but actually being able to present a really equitable set of options for young people without schools feeling that they're penalised at the funding level or at the structural level. So I think there was plenty in here.
Yeah.
Having been at the vocational reform launch, they were actually suggesting or mentioning a similar system to the hub system, and I think they call them regional. I can't remember what the German. Yeah,
regional hubs.
Yeah. They didn't mention the word hub, but it was a similar thing. So maybe we do. I mean, I've always endorsed the notion of from the cradle to the grave type education. Everyone talks about a child's whole journey, not just their life in early childhood or their life in primary. And a similar thing happens with students when you see these kids go, because I've been on all three, if you like, boards where the secondary blame the intermediate for the calibre of kids, the intermediate blame the primary blame the education sector. But if there was that whole journey,
let's take on intermediates because we haven't done that yet. So what's happening with intermediates, Bali?
It's interesting. Before I came here, I talked to the New Zealand Middle Schools Association, NZ Ames, I think it's called. And they were saying, the first headline was intermediate schools are being eliminated, I think was the headline. So the discussion around the task force was really about what our concerns were that the intermediate school with just a 2-year turnaround, where half the school population disappears every year, may not be the best way of organising things. And exactly, you've got boards of trustees that are appointed for 3 years. And when we went and talked, in our consultation process, we talked to the intermediate school principals, they agreed. They get it, because of course intermediate schools are a bit of an accident in New Zealand anyway. And so they sort of carried on. So our view was really around thinking about how we might structure the schooling system better. And there's a danger here. Somebody was talking about moving the deck chairs, and there's a danger here just changing the structure. It's actually the pedagogy, it's the teaching and the learning and making sure we get that right. So, we were thinking about, and it's in the report, the idea of middle schooling. And the research on middle schooling is ambivalent. It depends what you look at and who you read. So we're just putting out there for us to consider in our environment, in our particular priorities. But it seems to us that middle schooling pedagogy, the way we might organise that, is certainly worth thinking about. And when we got to that, we started thinking about what the consequences might be, and the possibility of senior colleges. And we quite like the discussion to occur in this country around how that might work, how senior colleges might become pre-work, pre-training, pre-university places, where you can provide a range of both vocational, academic, work-related activities for senior students, where you might get rid of some of the sort of school-ruly stuff that really becomes a sort of semi-adult step forward. So we quite like that idea as well, so we stuck that in. And then we thought, well, actually, New Zealand has got a hugely diverse population, and that's not going to work in parts of the country. So we need to think about that, because, you know, you can't have that configuration everywhere. And then we started thinking about transitions between schools. And we discovered that, you know, as students transition between schools, their performance drops off. So we thought of starting about 4 primaries, because of course middle schools don't reduce the number of transitions. It's the same number. So we ended up really in our report saying, we think the 2-year intermediate is a problem, and we need to think about a range of options to replace it depending on where we are and what we're looking at. And we suspect that local hubs will be a good place regionally to start talking those issues. And it's going to be, and I'm going to say this later, this is not something that's going to take place like tomorrow. We're not going to have schools, you know, empty or full or, you know, with tumbleweed. I mean, we're just not there. But it is a conversation we want to start.
Yes, Joe.
If you do recommend increasing middle school to 4 years, obviously the infrastructure in intermediate right now is designed to hold 2 years of students. Obviously that's really easy to the colleges, to the college in intermediate, where I went to, where they were right beside each other. Yeah. But what about the intermediates that only have infrastructure for 2 years of students and the college is quite far away? Yeah. So how do you foresee, you know, that sort of problem?
Well, I think that's what I'm saying to the others. I'm saying that you know, it's a conversation, and you move towards what it is you want, given the circumstances that you have in your area. That's what I'm saying. We are certainly not saying, you know, we must have middle schooling throughout New Zealand. We're saying, well, let's talk about it and see what works.
Yeah. Equally, as Barley has stated, we have hugely diverse populations. We also have hugely diverse schools. We have years 1 to 6, 1 to 8. We have 7 to 10, 11 to 13. We have Parikura, Kurakaupapa area schools. We have Tuakanataina. We have we have a myriad of schools in terms of that issue. So, I don't know, have a look at the years 7 to 10 model, because that already exists in New Zealand. What are they doing? And maybe rather than throw the baby out with the bathwater, we look at what's currently working well for them now, and how can we merge that notion with the idea that's in the report. Just another thought. But diversity in New Zealand, it's alive and well.
Bit of a shift. Could you help us talk through the role for external PLD providers and specialist service providers in this new ecosystem? So how do you envisage?
Yes, thank you. That was a reader question as well. Barley, do you want to
go?
take that?
Yeah, good. Thank you for that. And it's one of those things, I suppose, that I'll keep coming back to. That this what we are proposing here is not going to happen overnight. We are talking about a 3 to 5 year, probably more, transition process. We are talking about a phased approach to this, because we're really concerned that some of the history of education reform in this country has been problematic, because we've rushed it, we haven't built capacity, we haven't built capability, and we ended up giving teachers the work to do. That's effectively what's happened. So to answer your question, what we're saying, actually, one of the things that people have said to us is that there aren't the people in the system to do all this stuff that you want to do. And our view is that yes, there are. They're in there, they're doing stuff, but the problem is that they're not particularly well coordinated and coherent in what they do, and they're having to do it on their own. So it seems to me that there are really some excellent people out there doing stuff, and over time we would expect that the hub would be the mechanism to coordinate those activities. That's as far as I'm going to go in terms of to what extent people move into the hub, to what extent the hub is contracting. I don't want to, that's detailed policy work which needs to be done, but I think it needs to be coordinated and made coherent.
Karen, do you think there's a need to?
Well, I think one of the interesting things about the Tomorrow Schools model is that what we have also seen, and I've been part of it myself before I was at Wellington High, I was core education, learning media and so on, and I have seen what has happened to the competitive model around the provision of professional learning. I was in it, I was part of it, I could see the impact that it was having. Even now, I'm back in a school and you try and bid for professional learning for the ministry, and although there's registered providers, which is an attempt to kind of badge and show the relative quality of providers for schools, we've had exactly the same issues in that provision of support for capability as we've had in schools. That competitive model has meant that teachers can't access the support they need, that schools are competing for whoever's in the region. We don't have a real sense of who's providing quality support. So I think if there is again a system view around teacher capability, that could certainly include independent consultants, but at the moment they're all in the wind. It's hard to see who's providing what, where, and that's as a result of the, compete for the funding, compete to be on a panel, compete to supply schools, which is what's happening.
Can I just briefly, it seems to be a symptom of the problem, exactly that. What's happened to PLD is a wonderful exemplar of what's wrong with the system. How do we get to a position where support for teachers, the critical stuff, has ended up in this mess? It's a really good.
I think one of the things that teachers have been crying out for and absolutely haven't been able to have the time for is that professional development for teachers, by teachers, with teachers. So actually, as was said before, the people are within the system often who can actually provide support for their colleagues, but because of the way that our system is operating at the moment, they actually don't have the time, the ability or the connections to be able to do that outside their own particular environment. And even then, they haven't got the time to be able to actually work alongside their colleagues in that space.
Well, they're fabulous consultants, but they're competing with other consultants
to
get the work in schools. So that's, absolutely.
Any other thoughts on that thread? Do we have any other burning questions? Yes.
Vali, this is for you. I'm really interested in the hubs and thinking about why 20?
Oh, good question.
And also, how do you see the interrelationships between the hubs?
Yes, thank you. I had that down. I said, if somebody doesn't ask it, I'm going to answer it. So that's another one. That's another one we worry about in terms of the way the report came out, and we really, other members of the task force, and I'm going to acknowledge them at the end to make this is a team effort from the task force. Just want to acknowledge that. But we tossed around this business about the number of hubs and the number of schools, and we may have got it wrong. What we wanted to do was to say, what do we want these hubs to do? What are the outcomes we want? And we sort of listed it out, and then somebody said to us, well, people will want to know, and we picked 20 and 125 schools. And I think probably if I had my time over again, I'd be saying these are the services that we need to provide. Let's work through how many and how they're configured, because they're going to be different in Northland than they are to Auckland. The complexities so there's a whole pile of things that need to be done there. So I suppose my response to you is we gave that number. Some people are saying to us it's too large for what it is we want to do. I don't know, because the other way of looking at this is the hub is not necessarily, or it may be, but it's not necessarily exclusively a shiny building. If you think about the hub as a concept, there will be buildings, but if you think about the hub as a concept of a coordinated package deal, it doesn't have to be 20 buildings around the country. There's a whole pile of ways that you can provide access to teachers and schools close to their location and still have 20 hubs. So it's worth thinking about, and I think more policy work needs to happen.
Yes, and how do you see the interrelationship between them?
Yeah. Sorry. So one of the things we want to do is the hubs are pretty crucial to everything. So that's why what we have called the Education Evaluation Office. We've already said that we want to do away with reviewing 2,500 schools and then early childhood centres on top of that. But one option that we're really keen on is that the Evaluation Office has responsibility for evaluating the hubs. And that evaluation we see as both outcome-based, what are you doing, the usual sort of outcome measures, but also relationship-based, so that we're asking questions about the relationship between the hub and the school. One of the things I'd be saying to principals is, are the hubs delivering? Is there a collaborative thing going on between you and the hub? Those sorts of things. So the evaluation process of the office to the hub is one way of trying to get some consistency across the hubs. If that makes sense. We've also toyed with the idea of the Ministry of Education providing an opportunity for those hubs to coordinate, because the last thing we want is 20 different things happening around the country. And it is a risk. I think it is a risk, and we need to acknowledge that.
Could I just pick up on outcomes? So I think one of the other huge cultural shifts in the report is that the purpose of schooling for the last how many years has been around individual achievement. And if there's ever been a word overused in education lexicon, it's the word achievement. And I think the notion that it's about student success, which is a much bigger word, and that if you don't achieve, you might still be a successful human being, is an enormous shift from what we've had, and an understanding in terms of what you want as an outcome from a system is education as a public good rather than as an individual attainment or achievement. And that shift's really important. And if you think back to the previous consensus, we understood that schools had a range of purposes beyond training people for workforces. That actually, one of the central ones was that it protected our democracy. That we had schools because we made critical, creative citizens who could not just live in the world but change it. And it's the breadth of that challenge in this document that I think of all the things I find most exciting. So outcomes aren't just things that you count, but they're actually the important things about who we are as human beings. And that's a cultural shift which is enormous. And I think it will change behaviours. It will shift the factory model that we've laboured under in education for far too long.
So it's shifting the outputs to outcomes, because I actually see the NCA thing as outputs. You've got this many students doing this.
You had a previous Minister of Education talking about what she was most proud of was shifting an NCA result. Meaningless. Totally meaningless.
We'll make this our last question. Nick.
In the report, they use the concept of full service schools. Can somebody on the panel just expand a little bit on that concept?
Who'd like to?
What we were thinking, they sort of exist around the country at the moment in one form or another. What we were thinking was just about picking up, somebody was talking about earlier around, more flexible schooling. And we think that the concept of a school being a one-stop shop, if you like, in some parts of the country, in some locations, is a good one to pursue. So that school, as I say, it exists already. It has a health person, has a social worker, has a guidance counsellor, has a probation person, has a link with the police, and so you can build the services in the school so that the students are served in one place, and you get over all those agency issues.
I recall a paper from the GPTA a wee while ago around poverty in broader society and increasing inequity in certain parts of the country, and the idea that actually for many students school is the last safe haven, and it's the place that can wrap around you when nothing else will. And the idea, and it's not a new idea, the idea of a school providing the services that a young person needs if for whatever reason a family is not necessarily able to provide all of that. It's not a new model, it exists in other jurisdictions around the world. And I think in some parts we see certain schools beginning to offer those kind of services, but I think if we're going for the kind of outcome that you talked about, something like that would be incredibly exciting.
Thanks, Karen. I think we'll wrap up now. What I'd like to do is just get each panellist to share their main takeaways from this evening's conversation and where we'd like to head next. But perhaps if we start with you, Lorraine.
I've always believed that schools have been seen as the centre of society's woes. So every teacher, every principal, every support staff fix it. Here's $1 and we want $10 worth of fix it mode. And it goes back to what you talked about in terms of inequities around the system. The report, first of all, this has been great because I believe there's been a lot of courageous conversations being had and a lot of thinking about how do we fix it, because what I haven't heard is throw it away. I haven't heard let's do away with the report. I hope everyone in this room, and myself included, will help make whatever needs to happen in the best interests of kids. It is going to be complex, we know that. But we, as you said, it is about the we need to help make it happen. Kia ora.
Thank you, Lorraine.
I don't know why, but I was thinking that after the earthquakes in Christchurch, I spent 3 years working in schools in eastern suburbs. And there's a model of the outcomes that schools provide when the world's tipped literally upside down. And I think about the way in which they organically worked in hubs. That actually they moved away from the notion of I'm looking after my school. They looked after each other and they covered each other's backs. And there was a huge amount to be learnt by what happened in those schools in Christchurch, and then also what happened to many of them. But the possibilities of what you can do when schools work not just for themselves, but for the wider community in which they exist, and have an understanding that actually we're one country with many diverse parts, but we're all working for the same thing.
Thank you, Peter.
One of the things that I'm hearing, and like Lorraine, I haven't heard people say throw the report out, that there is a sort of quiet consensus, and in some places a loud consensus around the fact that we need to change, that there is some change that is needed within our system, that there is a sense that we need to be resourcing our education system better, and we need to be supporting our students better, and we also need to be supporting our people who work within the workforce better, the education workforce. One of the things that we don't do well, and Barley talked about this before, was we don't do change well in this country. So whatever happens as we move forward with this report, I think is going to be really, really important that we do give the time to it that actually does help what we see as being those things that need to happen. So if we believe that collaboration needs to be embedded within a system, then that is going to take time. It took 30 years for us to well and truly do the market model and competition. So we actually have to really be prepared to give time. And I know we're not all going to be around in 30 years' time, but anyway, we are going to have to give it time. And to do that, we are going to need people who are relentless about ensuring that the time is there for that to happen and that supported along the way. So one of the things that we haven't talked about is that change management group or establishment group or whatever they are called to actually oversee this process. And I think that that's a really important thing moving forward. I think we're in some really exciting times. We have some opportunities in front of us, and at the end of the day, this is about our kids and our people who work closest to our children.
It's been really great being here this afternoon and hearing the different views, and that has me thinking what might be really important going forward. I mean, the report at its heart is not it's not a fait accompli. It's the opening. It's a challenge for a discussion, and the thing that we have heard this afternoon is the fact we've given oxygen to views that we may not individually agree with. By the time I finished reading the report, my concern is that we won't necessarily give the time that's needed to debating the ideas. There's a line in the report that says that people have different views about what is fair and what is just, and people are not equally capable of making the system work in their and their children's interests. And even this afternoon, while I think generally the discussion seems to have been quite favourable about the report, there's definitely been challenge, and people are grappling with, is the problem worthy of these kind of solutions? Is this even the solution? And of course the report, it's not a science, it's an art. Actually, even Barley, with all his experience, and the team with all their experience, they don't have a crystal ball. We don't know exactly what the best solution will be. What we can do is trust that the ideas in the report are based on research, are based on the intention to increase the level of access and equity for all our young people. And I would urge, as you're kind of talking with colleagues and people who have an interest in this, to keep encouraging the consultation. I do think that the consultation timeframe is really tight. I think it's at the start of a very busy school year, and I'm hoping that there's enough space for the necessary debate and sharing of ideas to happen. But I applaud the work of the report, and it's been really great to hear all the questions this afternoon. So kia ora.
No, thank you for organising the debate. It's good to have the conversation, and I think the panel has said most of what I was going to say. I just
sure.
I suppose I can't resist.
Last word.
Just to repeat, it is about that. I know it sounds a bit odd, but cultural change, it's transformational change, and it's so hard. When people are in the busyness of their days, and it goes to your point about time, that to be aspirational, to think what it could be like in the next 10, 20, 30 years, to see what the possibilities are, and if we approach it with that, and critiquing the current system, but we approach it with that sort of mind frame, it seems to me we've got a fantastic opportunity, once in a generation opportunity, to really get stuck in and make a difference. We're doing great, but we can do so much better. And here's an opportunity for us to do that. So for me, a part of that change, part of the cultural change is that business about me, us. And that's why I think hubs, the concept of a hub, is absolutely fundamental to this report. If we get into a situation where people are saying we can't do this without something like a hub, I don't think it's going to go anywhere. So I need to make that really, really clear. The other thing I would say is that repeating, this is a messy process. Change is a messy process, and so we will expect problems, we will expect impediments, we'll get things wrong. But as long as we keep the aspiration really tight, we know where we want to go, then I think there's an opportunity that we can't actually miss. And I think the key to this all, and I'm going to finish on this if I may, and repeat, is cross-party support. And I'm going to ask you again before you leave to write down in your diary or make a knot in your handkerchief or something, to write to your MPs, to write to Nikki Kay, to write to Chris Hipkins, whether you agree with this report completely or whether you're not that hot on it. But the opportunity here for cross-party to make a difference and get this out of a political arena is too good to miss. So I'd ask you to get stuck in. Thank you.
Thank you, Blondie. Well, I'm delighted with the depth of conversation and debate we've had this evening, and I want to thank you all for being part of that. It wouldn't work without your input, and we really value it. We want to keep this a conversation going. We will be following up with articles, video clips, and so on Education Central. So please do contribute to that and keep it alive. To our panel, thank you so much for giving up your time and for bringing your passion and your expertise to the table tonight. It has been invaluable to be, and a privilege actually, to be part of this conversation. So one last round of applause for our panel.